Okay, so today we're going to dive into something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We've got some recent statements from a Russian envoy
Uh-huh.
talking about potential cooperation between the U.S. and Russia.
Okay.
And, given everything going on in Ukraine right now,
Right. Right.
it's pretty noteworthy, I think.
For sure.
And our main source for this is a BBC News interview.
Oh, okay.
So we're getting it straight from the horse's mouth, as they say.
Straight from the source.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
I mean, right off the bat,
Yeah.
we got to acknowledge that this is coming from a Russian official.
Right.
And our goal here isn't to pass judgment or say whether they're right or wrong,
Right.
but to really try and understand,
Yeah.
what are the key messages here?
Exactly.
What are they really trying to get across?
It's about reading between the lines.
Yeah, what does this tell us about how they see things?
Uh-huh.
You know how they see the relationship with the U.S.,
Right. Yeah.
where they think things might be headed?
And this guy, he didn't hold back.
No, he didn't.
He touched on a lot.
He did.
Like climate change,
Mm-hmm.
the Ukraine conflict,
Yeah.
even Elon Musk.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, right out of left field.
Yeah. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, I think a good place to start might be the Arctic.
Oh, the Arctic. Okay.
Yeah, because that came up a lot in the interview.
Right.
And what really struck me was how much he focused on climate change.
Okay. Yeah.
Specifically talking about the rising temperatures up there and how that's impacting the whole planet.
Right. Yeah, it's not just a regional issue. It
Exactly.
has global consequences.
Yeah, and he was framing this as a major area
Okay.
where the U.S. and Russia absolutely need to cooperate.
Interesting.
Yeah, like a shared responsibility because it affects everyone.
Makes sense.
And, this makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Oh, how so?
Well, Russia's strategic interests in the Arctic are growing.
Right. With the melting ice and all. Opening up those shipping lanes and resources.
Yeah, and that obviously has implications for the U.S. too,
Definitely.
both in terms of security and economically.
Right. So it's a potential flashpoint, but also a potential area for collaboration.
That's it, yeah.
Interesting.
And he didn't stop at just talking about the problem.
Okay.
He actually mentioned being open to joint investment opportunities
Oh, wow.
with the U.S. in the Arctic.
Okay, so they're talking business.
Yeah, specifically, he mentioned logistics
Uh-huh.
and other sectors too,
Okay.
but there's a catch.
I bet there is.
He made it very clear that any investment would need the approval of the Russian government.
Okay, so it's not exactly a free-for-all,
Right, they're open to cooperation, but
but on their terms.
exactly on their terms.
Yeah, that's a pretty consistent theme we see.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've got potential for cooperation in the Arctic,
Right.
but with strings attached.
Yeah. So now let's shift gears to the big one.
Ukraine.
Exactly. The elephant in the room. Now, this envoy, his main focus, he said, is economics and investment.
Okay,
But he still has some things to say about the political situation.
of course.
And what really stood out to me was this phrase he kept using.
What was that?
Very good dialogue.
Mm.
He claims that there's a very good dialogue happening.
With the U.S.
Yeah, with the U.S.
Okay.
And that the U.S. is really trying to understand Russia's perspective,
Interesting.
their constraints, their logic, the whole nine yards.
So he's painting a picture of open communication and understanding.
Yeah, exactly. Like things are moving in the right direction.
Okay, but given the current state of things,
Yeah.
is that really the full picture?
Right, because he went on to talk about how this dialogue is producing results.
Okay.
Specifically, he pointed to the stopping of strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure
Right.
as a huge step towards de-escalation,
Uh-huh.
and he attributed that directly to their communication with Russia.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, yeah.
I mean, sure, communication can help to de-escalate things,
yeah.
but there are usually a lot of factors at play.
Right, it's complicated.
Yeah, and to just say it's all because of their dialogue,
Yeah,
it feels a little simplistic maybe.
maybe.
But again, this is the narrative they're pushing.
Right.
He also brought up the Black Sea grain deal,
Oh, right.
saying that they're working on getting that going again.
Mhm.
And again, he framed it as a direct result of their communication.
So the message is dialogue equals progress.
Yeah, that seems to be the takeaway they want us to have.
Interesting. Okay, so then he went on to compare different U.S. approaches
Okay, this should be good.
to the conflict.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So he basically draws a line between the Biden administration
Uh-huh.
and the Trump administration.
Okay.
He says that Biden's approach is all about trying to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia,
Okay.
which he claims has only increased the risk of World War III.
Wow.
and hasn't actually stopped those attacks on energy infrastructure.
Because he's saying it's the wrong approach?
Yeah.
And what about Trump?
He contrasts that with Trump's approach,
Okay.
which he says was about trying to understand Russia
Yeah.
and finding solutions through dialogue.
Okay, so one's confrontational,
Yeah,
and the other is more about diplomacy.
exactly.
Okay, and I'm guessing he prefers the diplomacy.
You guessed it.
Shocker.
He even specifically said that it was the Trump administration's approach
Yeah.
that led to the stopping of those energy infrastructure attacks.
Which he's now saying are still happening.
Right. Which is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But the point is, he's presenting a very specific interpretation
Oh, absolutely.
of U.S. policy.
Yeah, and, it's important to remember this is just one perspective,
Absolutely.
and it's coming from a very specific place.
Right. He even addressed this.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he basically acknowledged that people might dismiss his statements as,
Kremlin talking points.
Yeah, exactly.
Propaganda.
But his argument was that you can't reach any kind of compromise
Right.
or resolution.
Yeah. If you don't even try to understand the other side's position.
Okay. I mean, he's not wrong about that.
Yeah, like, you can disagree with someone,
Yeah.
but you still need to understand where they're coming from.
If you want to find common ground.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
So, putting aside the immediate conflicts for a moment,
Okay.
he also talked about the future of economic cooperation.
Between the U.S. and Russia,
Yeah.
long term.
Right. And he acknowledged that right now,
Yeah,
the U.S. is focused on ending the war
of course.
and making sure Ukraine is in a strong negotiating position.
Mm-hmm.
So he basically said that any major economic cooperation
Yes,
is going to have to wait until the conflict is resolved.
that's realistic.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can't really talk about big business deals
Right.
when there's active fighting going on.
It just doesn't work that way.
So that was pretty straightforward.
Okay.
But then things took a bit of a turn.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he started talking about space exploration
Okay.
and Elon Musk.
Wow, out of nowhere.
I know, right? So what did he say?
Well, first he was like super complimentary towards Musk,
Okay.
calling him a great visionary and a historic person.
Blame it on Fick.
Yeah. And then he said that Russia has technologies,
Hmm.
specifically nuclear technologies,
yeah.
that could be useful for a mission to Mars.
That's interesting.
Yeah, right?
And, the idea of using nuclear power for space missions.
Yeah.
It's not totally out there.
Right.
I mean, it could provide a lot of energy for a base on Mars.
Right.
Or even be used for propulsion.
Yeah, so it's not impossible.
But it's definitely ambitious.
To say the least.
Yeah. And then he went on to say that they're actually planning video conferences.
With Musk's team
Yeah.
to talk about potential collaboration.
So they're serious about this.
Apparently, yeah.
Wow.
He even specifically suggested that Russia could provide a small nuclear power plant.
For a Mars mission.
Yeah.
That's a huge undertaking.
It is. It's almost hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. And then on top of all that, he threw in some compliments about Tesla and the Cybertruck.
Yeah, like randomly.
That was kind of weird.
It did feel a little out of place.
Yeah. Like, why bring that up?
Right? Is he just trying to butter Musk up?
Maybe he's a fan.
Maybe.
Or maybe it's all part of some bigger strategy.
Right. Who knows?
We might be reading too much into it.
Yeah. It's hard to say.
Okay, so space exploration aside,
Yeah. Back to reality.
back to Ukraine.
He did address the whole thing with the attacks on energy infrastructure.
Because he had said they had stopped,
Yeah.
and now they're happening again.
Right. So he basically acknowledged these reports,
Okay,
but he was very careful not to say who Russia thinks is responsible.
playing it safe.
Yeah, he just expressed hope that the pause in strikes
Right.
would hold and be a starting point for further de-escalation.
Okay, so he's not denying it's happening,
Right.
but he's also not taking any responsibility.
Exactly.
It's a delicate balancing act.
And he emphasized that this de-escalation,
Yeah.
it requires commitment from all sides. So while he presented it as a positive development,
Right.
he also acknowledged that it's very fragile.
It could fall apart.
Yeah, if everyone's not on board.
So it was a cautious optimism.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a step back and try to sum this all up.
Okay, big picture time.
Right, so this Russian envoy, he's really pushing the importance of dialogue.
With the U.S.
Yeah, even with all the tension and the conflict in Ukraine,
Mhm.
he's saying that they need to keep talking.
Okay.
And he highlighted the potential for cooperation in the Arctic,
Right.
especially around climate change and investment.
But with that caveat.
Yeah, on their terms.
Right, Russian government approval required.
Exactly. And then he presented this whole narrative where their communication
Yeah.
has already led to some positive steps.
Like the pause in attacks.
Right. And he contrasted that with how he sees the current U.S. administration's approach.
Compared to the previous one.
Yeah, he definitely has a preference there.
Yeah, it was pretty clear.
And then, looking ahead, he talked about the possibility of economic cooperation.
After the war ends.
Yeah, once the dust settles.
Okay.
And then out of nowhere, he brings up Elon Musk.
And space exploration.
And nuclear technology for Mars.
It was quite a twist.
It was.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure.
For me, I think the most striking thing is how differently he portrays
Right.
the approaches of those two U.S. administrations.
Yeah, the contrast was stark.
And it really highlights the Russian perspective on all this.
Right. What they see as constructive versus confrontational.
Exactly.
And then that whole thing with nuclear technology for Mars.
Yeah, that was wild.
It's almost hard to believe it came up.
It felt like it came out of nowhere.
It did.
But it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, who knows what might come of that.
And then finally, that cautious optimism about the de-escalation
Right.
mixed with the reality of those ongoing attacks.
Yeah.
It just shows how fragile the situation is
Absolutely.
and how much work there still is to do.
Okay, so now we want to hear from you.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on all this?
What do you see as the biggest opportunities or challenges?
For U.S.-Russia relations moving forward,
How do those different interpretations of the conflict,
and the different approaches of those administrations.
how does that all factor in?
Yeah, and what parts of this envoy's perspective resonated with you?
Or maybe challenged your existing understanding of the situation?
Because this is a complex geopolitical landscape,
It is, and there's no easy answers.
but it's a conversation we need to have.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a fascinating one for sure.
It has.
And we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.